This is part 4 on chapter 11 on Islamic political ideologies. So continuing on with this slide here, Islam in the United States. Switch over to a little bit to speaking about African Americans in Islam. So we think about, well, who exactly are Muslims living in the United States? African Americans account for about 30% of all. So you can see here also, as your book mentions, two Muslims have actually been elected to the U.S. House, right? U.S. House of Representatives. So remember, those are going to be representing specific districts instead of an entire state like a senator, except for those few, very unpopulated states where they only have one representative for the whole state. So you're probably familiar with some of these terms already. For example, the Nation of Islam. So those African Americans in the United States that would identify as Muslim, a huge majority of them would be kind of tied to this idea of the Nation of Islam. So you might be familiar with this, the kind of leader back from the period of the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, Elijah Muhammad. Of course, sort of seen as the kind of mentor, the sort of spiritual leader for Malcolm X. Now, of course, those two have a bit of a falling out towards the end, as documented pretty well in the movie with Denzel Washington, if you've had a chance to see that. But in any case, we often see those as a major connection there with the Nation of Islam. So it still exists today. So you might also be familiar with this name. So Louis Farrakhan, still very well known. So for example, he was actually, you can see here in Charlotte back in 2012. Right, so it says Louis Farrakhan says Obama must fight for his vision. So he was there. So you can see about 6,000 people came to see him at the Bojangles Coliseum there down kind of towards the east side of Charlotte. Right, so he was in Charlotte, kind of again marking this. Back in 1995, there was the Million Man March. Designed for African American men to come to Washington D.C. It's kind of a fellowship. Thinking about community building, particularly what to do with young people in the community, all those type of things. So he was there kind of to mark the 17th anniversary. So you can see here, right? So he's now over 80 years old. So it kind of be interesting to see if there kind of is another leader to kind of step up and sort of be a major leader for the Nation of Islam. All right. So also, your book, I think, describes this very well, where we think about Muslims in the United States. Again, a huge proportion of them come from Southeast Asia, not the Middle East, which again usually is the region that kind of comes to mind when we talk about Islam. But as you can see here, with respect to immigrant Islam, there's actually more Muslims in the United States than some Middle Eastern countries. Again, 300 million people, 320 million people in the United States. Our estimates, can range somewhere between 2 and 8 million. You can see 5 million I put here on this slide. So in any case, 5 million Muslims is quite a bit larger than a lot of the very small states of the Middle East. All right, continuing on here. So again, this slide's a little dated, but again, in the last 10, 15 years or so, a lot of this wouldn't have changed, so dramatically. So this you can see is a map of Muslims as a percentage of all residents from the year 2000. So as you might expect, a lot of Muslims that we find in the United States are centered in more urban metropolitan areas. So a lot of times on this map, you can kind of see where the larger cities are. So say for Georgia, you can kind of pick out the Atlanta region here. In North Carolina, you can kind of see the Research Triangle area with Chapel Hill, Durham, Raleigh, and of course in the Charlotte area here. Whereas much of sort of the rural United States, unsurprisingly, you're not going to find a huge percentage of Muslims as a part of the population. So one interesting thing people look at. So if you look at so this state up here, so this is Michigan. So you can see here that like sort of this Dearborn, Michigan area, is seen as or has a huge percentage of Muslims in the population. So sometimes we think about chain migration, which means people sort of makes sense for people that are already here, kind of facilitate more and more people coming over. So it's often what we've seen in the Dearborn area. All right, so same kind of idea here. Well, if we look at, well, again, that was the last slide was Muslims as percentage of the population. This slide looking at number of mosques in the United States by state. So you can see North Carolina is actually has more than many states. So this is it says 34 back in the year 2001. But if you look over here, you can see again. I mean, California is a huge state with almost 50 million people, but 227. So there's a very large number of mosques in California. And again, so for example, if you remember back to the chapter on feminism where I showed you some of those books by Khaled Hosseini, the Afghan author, like A Thousand Splendid Suns and The Kite Runner, he talks about growing up in Fremont, California. So again, a lot of sort of, again, we think about immigrant Islam, a lot of folks ended up in California. So again, that's why you see such a huge number here. So again, some states, very few, right? So South Dakota, just one. New York, of course, as you might expect, a large number of mosques as well. So again, Islam is growing in the United States. So in the coming decades, we'll likely see many of these numbers increase. All right. So mentioned briefly previous slide with African Americans and Islam. So just a couple books I've put in here. Again, if you're interested in reading in your own time, that there is a lot of scholarship on that particular community here in the United States. Samari Rashid, you can see here, has written Black Muslims in the U.S., History, Politics, and the Struggle of a Community. And then we have over here from Edward Curtis, Islam and Black America. So you can see over here to the right where my cursor is, so that's Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, of course, here, and then here with the over on this side with the goatee. Now, of course, during this time period, particularly with the just how well known Malcolm X was in the country, perhaps the Nation of Islam, the African American Muslims were seen as more of a kind of political force, whereas maybe in recent decades it's not as much as it was during the sort of heyday of sort of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X period. All right, so finishing up here a little bit with the chapter, we're going to look at just some current trends. So one of the general themes we've looked at in this chapter is the sort of deep division really among Muslims throughout the world, as far as those folks that want to stay more traditional, that kind of reject all things Western, more technological, that type of things, and then those that want to be more sort of open, more accepting of others, all those type of things. So, for example, Islamic liberals, again, this idea of advocating for a more sophisticated reading of the Quran. So, Islamic feminists, for example, would say, like Christian feminists or Jewish feminists and so on, would look at the Quran or the Bible or other religious texts and say, well, of course, you would have to read some of that in relation to the society of today. So, for example, the Bible, the Quran, and so forth, talk about slavery. Now, I mean, more like sort of in an institutionalized, very much more of a commonplace form of slavery. But of course, we don't have that in the United States today. So, again, everything that's mentioned in those texts, sometimes it's hard to, apply some of that directly to a more modern society. So I've listed a few authors here, right? So these are some examples of more, we think of Islamic liberals or more sort of, modern thinkers in the Muslim community. So, for example, they would say that Islam does not exclude adaptation to the modern world. And I said, if you really read the Quran, that there's this more of a focus on human rights, equality, those type of things. And they argue, that's really the more important stuff to focus on, not some of the little, minutiae, the kind of minor details of certain things, right? They kind of say, look, would the Prophet Muhammad and others from those times, would they really say, Muslims should not adapt to the modern world, those type of things, right? So again, we see those same arguments made in other religions as well. All right. Um, so another kind of thing they would argue about with respect to the immigrant community is this quote here. It says they can and should be both believers and full citizens of their adopted countries, with the emphasis on being both. Now, in some ways that might sound like it's a little bit in conflict, but their argument is saying, look, you can be a 100% true believer, but still be a good U.S. citizen or still be a good British citizen, that type of thing. That it doesn't have to necessarily be one or the other. That really you can do both. And in many ways, being a true believer also kind of goes hand in hand with being a full citizen, where you're doing well by your children in school, doing well by your community, all those type of things that we really think about as good sort of hallmarks of citizenship. All right, so then this is our last slide here to kind of finish up this chapter 11. So, again, these are just some other current issues facing Muslims in the world today. So one of the key, again, debates here is this sort of religious issues versus socioeconomic issues. So often, say, for example, in France or other Western European countries, they've had some real challenges with this. So, for example, again, is the problem that people are Muslim, for, sort of the more mainstream, white Christian French society, or is it the fact that they often tend to be in lower socioeconomic positions? So sometimes the religion is a kind of attached to more, just general problems like, economic status, socioeconomic status, that type of thing. So sometimes we have to think about, sort of separating those two and make sure we're not always thinking about one and the other. So your book also mentions, the big cartoon controversy when some newspapers in Denmark published some, I guess you could say, more unflattering cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. And, the important thing to remember here is in a lot of these cases, people that are more sort of firebrands or more, ones that want to be angry and go against, what's expected of them in society and so forth, where your book mentions, and other writers have talked about this, that the cartoons in question here actually came out months or even I think a year or two before some of the riots and all the anger happened related to them. So again, that kind of shows, or clearly shows, that people are kind of using them to sort of manipulate others. That they say, hey, people will get riled up if we make them pay attention to these cartoons. So the same thing with, you might remember a couple years ago, right around September 11th in 2012, right, there was this movie depicting the Prophet Muhammad that came from the United States and led to riots in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But again, a lot of that was sort of just used as more of for propaganda purposes. All right, so then we also have seen where there's this kind of more of an extreme reaction to Islam, where in many Western European countries, and even somewhat here in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, people in the very sort of staunch conservatives are very wary of some cultural influences from Islam and so forth. They kind of worry about their country being overran or kind of overtaken by Muslims. So one expression of that is that, looking at Sharia law, that politicians and so forth, even in Oklahoma here in the United States, where very few Muslims live, Oklahoma, they tried to pass a law banning Sharia law. Now that wasn't really even an issue, but the politicians there were kind of using that to kind of gin up a bit of fear and resentment against that community. But in some ways, this relates to the overall, from a Western viewpoint, Islam, as a result of 9/11, terrorism, all these other things, that where people in the West, right, United States, Western Europe, and so forth, view Islam as a radical religion and tend to associate it with terrorism. Now, of course, with 1.2, 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, of course, not all of them are terrorists, but we do see more terrorism coming from this group. So again, you can see some of the tension there. So this marks the end of chapter 11.